The Millionaire CEO was dining with his fiancée when two little girls walked up and said, "You're our dad." Uriel Hector had just lifted his glass when the girl spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to cut through the murmur of a crowded dining room. "You're our dad." The words landed between the plates of half-eaten food like a dropped blade. Across from him, Janae froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. Around them, laughter carried on. Servers moved past. Glasses clinked. The world didn't pause for the sentence that had just split his life open. The second girl tightened her grip on her sister's hand. Her chin trembled, but she didn't look away. Uriel's heartbeat drowned out everything else. He didn't recognize them. No memory stirred. No connection formed. Just two faces waiting for an answer he didn't have. Before he could speak, a woman's voice came from behind them, thin with nerves. "Girls, please don't interrupt." He turned, and 10 years walked back into his life. Be honest with yourself for a moment. What would you do if the one thing you believed was finished, buried under years of work, ambition, and reinvention, suddenly stood in front of you with a trembling voice and hopeful eyes? Have you ever built a life so carefully that it finally looked complete, only to sense something hollow in the quiet moments? Maybe you've chased goals because stopping felt dangerous. Maybe you've kept moving because slowing down might force you to face questions you never answered, the kind that wait patiently, growing heavier with time. Uriel thought he had done everything right. He escaped a childhood that taught him not to depend on anyone. He turned discipline into money, distance into success, solitude into strength. And yet, sitting in that restaurant, he felt smaller than he ever had before. Because nothing terrifies an adult more than realizing the story they've been telling themselves might not be true anymore. There's a fear most people never say out loud. It isn't about failure at work or losing money. It's the fear of becoming the very person who once broke you. Uriel grew up staring at an empty chair at the dinner table, a space no one ever explained. A man vanished, and a boy learned that absence could shape an entire life. So he built himself into someone who never needed anyone, who controlled every variable he could reach. Now 2 children stood in front of him, carrying a question he had spent his whole adulthood running from. Was he about to repeat a pattern he hated? Was success just another way to disappear? That is the moment this story lives in. Not the surprise, not the wealth, the internal reckoning. The instant a man understands that his past isn't behind him, it's waiting to see who he becomes when he's no longer in charge. By the end of this story, you're going to know the answer to a question Uriel never allowed himself to ask. Not whether he can afford to raise children, not whether he has the schedule or the patience, but whether a man who spent his entire life avoiding emotional attachment can learn to stay when every instinct tells him to retreat. Because the truth is, money doesn't prepare you for a moment like this. Reputation doesn't help. Power doesn't either. When 2 children claim you in front of the woman you plan to marry, all the titles in the world collapse into silence. Uriel had always believed that discipline could replace connection, that ambition could replace intimacy, that providing was the same as loving. This night was about to prove him wrong, and the choice he makes next won't just change his future. It will decide whether the cycle he swore to escape finally ends with him. If any part of this moment feels uncomfortably familiar, if you've ever felt caught between who you're becoming and who you used to be, take a second and support the channel. Tap the like button so this story can reach others who are walking the same tightrope between ambition and connection. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Mr. Williams Storytime so you don't miss narratives that speak to real life, not polished fantasy. Stories like this don't exist just to entertain. They exist to remind us that no matter how far we run or how much we achieve, some questions follow us quietly until we're brave enough to face them. Your engagement helps keep these stories coming, the kind that don't sugarcoat life but still leave room for hope. Uriel didn't answer the girls right away. He couldn't. All he could do was stare at the woman standing behind them, the one face he never expected to see again. Her eyes held years he didn't deserve to remember, years she had carried alone. The restaurant noise pressed in on him now, every sound too sharp, every glance from nearby tables feeling like a quiet judgment. Janae was still beside him, silent, steady, waiting to see which version of the man she loved would show up. Because this story isn't about shock. It's about a boy who learned that leaving was normal, a teenager who decided that control felt safer than closeness, a man who believed he had outrun everything that once hurt him, and now, without warning, the life he never planned for had stepped directly into the one he was so proud of building. To understand why this moment shook Uriel to the core, you have to go back to where he learned to disappear in the first place. Uriel Hector was born in a town most people only noticed when they needed to stop for gas. The factories that once paid for college educations and decent houses had been closing for years by the time he started school. Empty storefronts sat with dusty windows and fading signs that promised deals no one was left to care about. The town wasn't cruel. It was tired. And tired places raised cautious children. Uriel learned early that ambition was something you kept to yourself. Teachers praised dreams but warned about reality. Guidance counselors spoke in careful tones about being practical. The boys he grew up with expected to follow their fathers into whatever jobs were still standing. The girls talked about leaving, though few ever did. His home was a narrow rental with thin walls and uneven floors, the kind of place where every noise traveled and privacy was a rumor. On winter mornings, frost crept along the inside of the windows, tracing patterns no one bothered to admire. Heat cost money, and money was something the Hector household rarely had enough of. Uriel filled his free time with borrowed library books and after-school computer labs. While other kids chased rides from older friends, he learned how to write basic programs and stayed late to finish assignments. He didn't talk much about what he wanted to become. Wanting felt risky in a place where hope usually outpaced opportunity. What he did talk about, when anyone managed to get him talking, was leaving. Not in the dramatic way teenagers sometimes do, but as a quiet certainty. This town had given him food, shelter, and not much else. He didn't resent it. He simply didn't belong to it. By the time he reached his teens, he was already different. Not louder, not rebellious, just distant. Teachers described him as disciplined. Classmates called him serious. No one guessed how carefully he watched the world around him, studying what stayed and what vanished, learning which people mattered and which ones didn't seem to. Long before success found him, Uriel had made up his mind about one thing. He would not stay where life felt small. If the town taught Uriel to be cautious, his mother taught him endurance. She worked at a diner just off the highway, a place where truckers stopped for coffee that tasted burnt no matter how fresh the pot was. Her schedule wasn't written in ink. It changed every week, sometimes every day, depending on who quit, who got sick, or whose car wouldn't start that morning. Uriel learned to recognize her footsteps in the hallway long before he learned to read. Some nights they were light, hopeful. Other nights they dragged, each step heavier than the last, as if she had to convince herself to cross the threshold into a home she barely had time to live in. She tried to hide how tired she was. She left encouraging notes on the fridge, packed lunches with careful precision, and asked about school even when her eyes refused to stay open. On Sundays, when she was lucky enough to be home, she'd nap on the couch with the television humming softly, one arm draped over her face to block out the light. Uriel never complained. He learned how to cook simple meals, how to wash his own clothes, how to wait. Waiting became his strongest skill, waiting for her to get home, waiting for the electricity not to be cut off, waiting for something better. Once, when he was 12, he stayed up until almost midnight to show her a certificate he'd earned for a science project. She hugged him, said she was proud, and fell asleep before he finished explaining what the project was about. That night, Uriel placed the certificate back into his backpack. He wasn't angry at her. He understood more than he should have. Her exhaustion wasn't neglect, it was survival. But a child can understand hardship and still feel alone inside it. Watching his mother give every ounce of herself to a job that barely noticed her carved something deep into him. He decided then that he would never trade his life for a paycheck. He would never beg a clock for permission to rest. If she survived by enduring, he would survive by escaping, and he would do it quietly, without asking anyone to save him. The day his father left didn't come with shouting or slammed doors. There was no argument Uriel could replay in his head years later, no warning signs he could trace backward. One evening his father was there, boots by the door, jacket slung over a chair. The next morning the house felt larger in a way that made his chest tighten. At first Uriel assumed it was temporary. Adults came and went all the time in that town. Overtime shifts, late nights, broken down cars. He waited for the sound of the front door that never came. His mother didn't talk about it. She packed lunches. She paid bills. She held herself together with a determination that didn't leave room for questions. The chair at the table stayed empty, but no one explained why. Weeks passed. Then months. The boots were moved into a closet. The jacket disappeared. And eventually, even Uriel stopped expecting to see his father again. What stayed was the silence. Friends at school asked where his dad had gone. Teachers avoided the topic altogether. Family members sent cards that never mentioned his name. It was as if an entire person had been erased from their lives, leaving behind only habits that took years to unlearn. Uriel tried once to ask his mother if his father was coming back. She looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look adults use when they don't know how to protect a child from the truth. Then she said, "Let's get ready for school," and the conversation ended there. He never brought it up again. Instead, he watched. He watched how people spoke about loyalty while leaving anyway, how promises were easy to make and harder to keep, how one person could step out of a life and expect the world to adjust. That empty chair became his quiet instructor. It taught him that people don't always leave because they're cruel. Sometimes they leave because staying feels heavier than walking away. And if that was true, then the safest way to live was to never need anyone enough to feel that weight yourself. By the time he reached high school, Uriel had already learned his most important lesson. If you don't let people matter too much, they can't disappear in ways that change you. Uriel didn't mark the day he made his vow. There was no dramatic moment, no clenched fists in a bedroom mirror. It formed quietly, the way long habits do, through observation, disappointment, and the steady math of cause and effect. People who depended on others got hurt. His mother depended on tips and kindness that rarely came. His father depended on a version of life he couldn't maintain. Both ended up carrying more than they should have. So Uriel chose a different formula. He became precise. He scheduled his time. He saved money in envelopes hidden behind old textbooks. He competed with himself more than with anyone else, measuring success in grades, awards, scholarships, proof that effort could replace trust. When friends invited him out, he usually declined. When teachers offered praise, he nodded politely and returned to work. Praise didn't change outcomes. Preparation did. In college, while others treated freedom like a celebration, Uriel treated it like a test. He stacked part-time jobs, coded through the night, skipped gatherings that promised fun but no return on investment. He wasn't punishing himself, he was training. Every sacrifice felt like insulation against disappointment. He didn't talk about feelings because feelings were variables he couldn't manage. He didn't lean on anyone because leaning created leverage, and leverage could always be used against you. Over time, people stopped trying to get close. They described him as focused, disciplined, impressive. None of those words meant lonely, but that was the result all the same. By the time his first startup showed signs of life, Uriel had already perfected the role of someone who didn't need anything from anyone. He told himself this was strength. But deep down, the vow was simpler than it looked. Never be weak. Never need anyone. The world rewarded Uriel for everything he had practiced. While classmates struggled to turn ideas into income, his first software venture sold before most people learned how to manage a budget. Investors didn't need convincing. His numbers spoke clearly, efficiently, without apology. By his early 30s, his name appeared in business articles that praised discipline and innovation in the same breath. He bought a condo overlooking Lake Michigan, not because he needed the space, but because he could. Floor-to-ceiling windows, polished surfaces, furniture chosen by designers who spoke about mood and balance. On paper, it was a victory. In reality, it was quiet in a way that made his thoughts louder. There was no one to share meals with, no stray shoes by the door, no clutter that hinted at a life being lived instead of maintained. At night, the sound of traffic far below reached him as a dull murmur, reminding him that the city was awake even when he wasn't. People admired him. They sought his advice, copied his routines, asked how he stayed so composed under pressure. He offered tips about time management and goal setting, never about what it felt like to come home to a space that seemed untouched by emotion. Sometimes he stood at the windows after midnight, watching the lights ripple across the lake, wondering why success felt lighter than he expected. He had everything he'd aimed for, yet nothing in the room suggested that he mattered to anyone beyond his output. He told himself it was temporary, that one day he'd make room for a personal life. When things slowed down, they never did. His calendar stayed full, his inbox overflowed, his bank account grew, and the apartment remained spotless. Achievement had carried him farther than he imagined, just not toward the connection he once pretended he didn't need. The penthouse was supposed to be proof that he'd made it. It sat high above the lake, where the wind pressed softly against glass walls that cost more than his childhood home ever had. Visitors complimented the view, the lighting, the art pieces selected to suggest taste rather than tell a story. Everything in the apartment looked intentional. Nothing in it felt personal. There were no photos on the shelves, no magnets on the refrigerator, no scuffs on the baseboards from people passing through too often. Even the guest room felt staged, as if it were waiting for someone who never quite arrived. Uriel told himself he preferred it this way. Clutter distracted him. Sentiment slowed him down. The absence of chaos meant he could think clearly. That was the story he repeated while pacing the living room late at night, phone glowing in his hand as he skimmed emails that could wait until morning. Sometimes he poured a drink he didn't really want and stood near the windows, looking down at the steady movement below. Cars traced routes across the city. Lights blinked from apartment to apartment. Somewhere in all of that motion, people were arguing, forgiving, laughing, hurting, building lives that would never appear on a balance sheet. From up here, everything looked manageable. Yet when he turned back toward the room, the quiet followed him like a shadow. No one interrupted his thoughts. No one challenged his routines. No one left behind reminders that time was passing whether he acknowledged it or not. The penthouse reflected exactly who Uriel had become. Successful, controlled, untouched, and, without ever admitting it to himself, alone in a way no promotion had ever fixed. Uriel met Janae in a place he normally avoided. It wasn't a boardroom or a networking dinner or a sleek office tower with glass walls and catered lunches. It was a volunteer appreciation event he attended out of obligation, the kind of appearance his publicist insisted would make him seem approachable. He arrived late and planned to leave early. Janae was standing near the refreshment table, laughing at something a teenager had said, not the polite laugh people give when they're trying to be kind, the kind that tips your head back and escapes before you can filter it. She didn't recognize him. That was the first thing that disarmed him. She introduced herself without titles, asked what he thought of the food, complained that the punch tasted like it came from a plastic bottle. When he finally told her his name, she blinked, processed it, then shrugged. "Well, I guess you're famous," she said. "That doesn't make you interesting." No one had spoken to him like that in years. They talked about books instead of work, about the way cities can feel lonely even when they're loud, about her habit of rescuing broken furniture from sidewalks and fixing it instead of buying new. Uriel didn't tell her about the penthouse. He didn't list his accomplishments. He listened. Over the next few weeks, they crossed paths again, once at a cafe near the lake, another time at a charity event she was running. She never tried to impress him. She asked about his day and waited for real answers. Without noticing the shift at first, Uriel started leaving his phone face down during conversations. He arrived on time instead of calculating how quickly he could leave. He laughed more easily, a sound that felt unfamiliar even to him. Janae didn't demand that he change. She simply made space for a version of him he'd forgotten how to be, one that could linger in moments without measuring their usefulness. For the first time in years, he felt less like a machine built for output and more like a man allowed to exist without justification. Janae didn't talk about her work the way people usually do. There was no pitch, no polished summary of impact metrics or donor numbers. She spoke about people, names, habits, the small victories that never made it into reports. She ran a community nonprofit on the South Side, focused on after-school programs for kids whose parents worked the same exhausting schedules his mother once did. The building wasn't impressive. The paint peeled in places, and the heating system protested every winter. Yet every afternoon the rooms filled with voices that sounded hopeful in ways spreadsheets couldn't capture. Uriel visited once, expecting to stay 10 minutes. He ended up staying 2 hours. He watched her kneel to talk to a boy who refused to do his homework, not with threats, but with curiosity. He saw her clap when a shy girl finally read a paragraph out loud without stumbling. There was nothing performative about it. She wasn't doing charity. She was building familiarity, trust, a sense that someone would show up again tomorrow. Later, as they walked back to her car, she apologized for the mess, for the noise, for the fact that her office chair wobbled when she leaned too far back. "I keep meaning to replace it," she said, laughing at herself. Uriel thought about the thousands he'd spent on furniture chosen by consultants who never asked who he was. He thought about the emptiness of his own living room and the warmth he'd just witnessed in a building that barely held together. "You don't have to apologize," he told her. "This place matters." She looked at him, surprised. "You noticed?" Of course he did. For years he'd measured success by distance. How far he could move away from the town that shaped him, from the people who reminded him of everything he wanted to outgrow. Janae measured success by proximity, how close she could stay to those who needed someone to care. Being around her shifted something he'd considered permanent. It didn't make him softer in the way people feared. It made him present. Uriel didn't plan the proposal the way he planned business moves. There were no consultants, no schedule, no hidden cameras waiting to turn the moment into content. He chose a quiet pier along the lake because it was the one place in the city where he felt grounded instead of elevated. Janae thought they were just going for a walk. The sun was lowering itself into the water, not dramatically, just enough to soften the edges of the day. They leaned on the railing and watched boats drift past, neither of them speaking for a while. Silence with her felt different than silence anywhere else. It didn't press on him, it rested. He didn't kneel at first. He told her that he was bad at expressing things that mattered, that he'd spent most of his life building walls he no longer knew how to lower, that being with her hadn't fixed him, but it had made him want to try. Then he reached into his pocket and held out a small velvet box that suddenly made his hands feel unsteady. Janae didn't cry. She laughed, a surprised, breathless laugh that made him realize he'd been holding his own breath too. She said yes before he finished asking, then leaned her forehead against his as if the rest of the world could wait. There were no strangers cheering, no applause, just the sound of water and the distant hum of traffic. Later, when they told friends, people assumed the moment must have been extravagant. Uriel let them believe it. He didn't explain that the most important part wasn't the ring or the view. It was the feeling that he'd finally chosen something for reasons that had nothing to do with safety or advantage. For the first time, his future didn't look like a strategy. It looked like a shared life. After the engagement, Uriel felt lighter in ways he didn't know how to explain. It wasn't excitement in the loud, restless sense. It was quiet confidence, the sense that something long unsettled had finally found a place to rest. He moved through days with less urgency, left meetings 5 minutes early instead of 5 minutes late, started imagining rooms in his penthouse as spaces for people rather than proof of success. With Janae, he didn't talk much about where he came from. She knew the basics: small town, working mother, absent father. He delivered the story cleanly, like a summary you give when the details feel unnecessary. He had no desire to revisit that time. In his mind, it belonged to a finished chapter. Sometimes she asked gentle questions about college or his first company. He answered easily. But when her curiosity drifted toward relationships before her, he brushed past it without resistance or explanation. "There's nothing there anymore," he said once, not dismissively, just with certainty. And he believed it. His life felt carefully sealed. Every move he'd made since leaving Ohio pointed forward. New city, new work, new routines, new person beside him. The people he once knew existed only as names he no longer used. That's what growth meant to him. Choosing the direction of your story and refusing to turn back. He didn't consider that other people carried chapters he had closed. He didn't consider that silence wasn't the same as resolution. He didn't consider that walking away from a moment didn't mean it stopped existing. Janae sensed this about him. She didn't challenge it directly. She accepted his boundaries while watching how carefully he defended them, as if something fragile lived just behind the wall. To Uriel, the past wasn't painful. It was irrelevant, and that belief was the foundation on which he built the life he thought was finally secure. Before this story moves forward, pause for a moment. Uriel is standing at a point many people recognize but rarely talk about. He believes he has outgrown the version of himself shaped by loss, by unfinished conversations, by people he never circled back to. He believes love and stability have rewritten his future. But here's the question that matters. Do you think anyone can truly leave their past behind? Not manage it, not outrun it. Actually leave it, as if it no longer has a voice. Some people say yes. They say time heals, distance erases, reinvention works if you commit to it fully. They point to new careers, new relationships, new habits, as proof that yesterday doesn't get to decide tomorrow. Others believe the opposite, that the moments we avoid become the ones that shape us most, that the conversations we never finish don't fade, they wait. So I want to hear from you. Type yes in the comments if you believe people can completely move on from where they came from. Type no if you believe the past always finds a way to speak again, no matter how successful or careful someone becomes. And if this story is already pulling at something in your own life, make sure you're subscribed to Mr. Williams' Storytime. Stories like this don't exist to offer easy answers. They exist to hold up a mirror and ask the questions we tend to avoid. Your voice is part of this journey. Uriel met Raina before he learned how to hide who he was. They were both students at a state university far from the towns that shaped them, carrying secondhand laptops and dreams that felt too large for dorm rooms that smelled faintly of instant noodles and laundry detergent. Raina studied social work, spoke with her hands, and had a laugh that didn't wait for permission. She asked questions most people didn't. Why did he study until dawn? Why did he never talk about home? Why did he treat opportunity like a deadline? Uriel didn't have neat answers. With her, he didn't need them. They spent late nights trading stories about childhoods that taught them to grow up early. He told her about the diner, the empty chair, the town that pressed on his lungs. She told him about a family that loved loudly and fought just as loudly, about siblings who borrowed clothes without asking, about noise that felt like belonging. They argued sometimes, about money, about priorities, about what it meant to succeed. Uriel spoke in plans and projections. Raina spoke in impact and people. Neither was wrong, but they weren't always aligned. What they shared was momentum. They built dreams on the floors of their rooms, mapping out futures neither could afford yet. He wanted to build things that lasted. She wanted to make sure they lasted for the right reasons. During his final year, he received an offer to join a startup across the country. It wasn't glamorous. It was risky. But it was the first door that looked like escape with a salary attached. Raina was proud of him. That was never the problem. The problem was the shape of the life he was choosing. They sat on a bench outside the library the night he told her he was leaving in 2 weeks. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She listened the way she always did, absorbing the truth rather than reacting to it. "I don't want to be the thing you step over to become who you are," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a boundary. Uriel tried to explain that this wasn't goodbye, that long distance was temporary, that once he was established, everything else would follow. He spoke with conviction because he believed it. Raina looked at him with a calm that unsettled him. You don't choose people the way you choose goals, she replied. You either stay or you don't. They parted with a hug that lasted a second too long and meant far more than either admitted. Uriel boarded his flight believing he'd made the mature decision. He didn't know he'd just left more behind than he could measure. Distance didn't ruin them right away. At first, Uriel called every night. He talked about the new office, the cramped desks, the energy of people who believed they were building something meaningful. Raina told him about her classes, the families she interned with, the children who trusted too easily, and the parents who cared more than they admitted. Weeks passed, then months. His calls became shorter. Hers became less frequent. Not because either of them stopped caring, but because caring began to feel like a task rather than a refuge. Uriel lived by calendars now, product launches, investor meetings, deadlines that refused to bend. He told himself he was building a foundation for both of them, but Raina felt the gap growing in the pauses between his words. When she visited him for the first time, she barely recognized his life. He lived with roommates who spoke in stock options and product roadmaps. They ate takeout in front of glowing screens. No one looked up when someone entered the room. It wasn't cold, it was transactional. One night, after he canceled their dinner plans for the third time in a week, Raina closed his laptop gently and asked, "Is there a version of your life that includes me when things get busy?" He didn't answer right away. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to believe it, but his silence was an answer all its own. They didn't break up in a storm. There was no dramatic exit or slammed door. They talked until words felt thin, until honesty replaced hope. "You don't leave people," Raina said quietly. "You just keep choosing other things until they disappear." Uriel told her he was trying, that he needed time, that everything would make sense later. Raina smiled at him in the way people do when they're already letting go. "I won't be the part of your life that waits to matter," she said. They hugged goodbye in the hallway of his apartment building, her suitcase standing upright like a witness. Uriel watched her walk away, believing he'd done the responsible thing. He didn't realize that responsibility without presence is just another form of absence. Raina discovered she was pregnant a week after the breakup. The test sat on the edge of the sink while she stared at it, her mind refusing to settle on a single thought. Shock came first, then disbelief, then a calm that felt almost out of place. She wasn't afraid of being a mother. She was afraid of what the timing meant. She picked up her phone and typed Uriel's name. Then she erased it. What would she say? That the future he'd chosen had just gained 2 fragile heartbeats? That the distance he insisted was temporary had become permanent in a way no plane ticket could undo? She imagined the look on his face, the rush of obligation, the way responsibility would replace choice. She knew him too well to pretend otherwise. He would come back out of duty, not desire. So she waited. Days turned into weeks. Her body changed in ways that were easy to hide beneath loose sweaters and long walks. She finished her semester and accepted a position at a community center close to her apartment. Routine became her anchor. Sometimes, late at night, she rehearsed the conversation she might eventually have. Sometimes she wrote messages she never sent. Most nights she placed a hand over her stomach and told the life forming there that she would find a way. She wasn't angry at Uriel. She was protecting him from himself. If she told him now, he would feel cornered. And Raina refused to become the reason he stayed in a life he hadn't chosen freely. She'd seen too many families built on obligation rather than presence. She wouldn't create another. So she chose silence, not because she wanted to erase him, but because she wanted their children to be claimed with intention, not guilt. By the time she could no longer hide the truth, she had already decided how she would carry it. The doctor told her it was twins, as if announcing something ordinary. Raina stared at the screen, at 2 separate flickers she didn't yet understand, and felt the world tilt gently off its axis. She laughed once, a quiet sound that surprised even her. 2. She walked home instead of taking the bus, letting the cold air keep her steady while her thoughts raced. 2 children meant twice the expense, twice the energy, twice the courage she would need to find inside herself. That night, she opened a notebook and began planning a life no one had asked her to imagine. She calculated rent, childcare, hours she could work, people she could lean on. She crossed out dreams that no longer fit, and rewrote them in smaller, sturdier shapes. She didn't hate Uriel for not being there. She chose not to invite him yet. Raina moved into a cheaper apartment with creaky floors and neighbors who spoke through thin walls. She took on extra shifts and learned to accept help without feeling like she'd failed. When the twins arrived, Carmela first, determined and loud, Phoebe second, watchful and calm, she held them both and felt something settle into place. There were nights she cried from exhaustion, mornings she smiled through it, afternoons when the future felt like a puzzle missing half its pieces. She learned how to carry groceries with one hand while balancing a stroller with the other. She learned how to celebrate small victories, a good night's sleep, a laugh that came easily, a bill paid on time. She told herself she would explain everything to Uriel one day, but the right moment never appeared. Every year that passed made the conversation heavier. The twins asked about their father in ways that were easy to redirect at first and harder later. Raina never spoke badly of him. She simply said he lived far away and that families come in many forms. When illness finally forced her to reckon with the limits of doing everything alone, she realized that silence had run its course. Her daughters deserved to know who they came from, and Uriel deserved the chance to choose who he would become. Uriel had chosen the restaurant because it felt safe, not trendy enough to attract cameras, not quiet enough to invite attention. A place with low music, soft lighting, and tables spaced just far enough apart to suggest privacy without promising it. Janae was telling a story about a grant proposal that had nearly fallen apart when the waiter arrived with their wine. Uriel listened, nodding at the right moments, his hand resting near hers on the table. He wasn't thinking about the past. He was thinking about wedding colors and guest lists and whether he should finally put something personal on the walls of the penthouse. The room buzzed with ordinary life. Couples leaned toward each other. A birthday group clapped at a neighboring table. Somewhere behind them, someone laughed too loudly at a joke that wasn't that funny. This was the life he believed he had earned, calm, predictable, forward-facing. He lifted his glass, ready to interrupt Janae with a toast about nothing in particular. That was when two small shadows appeared beside the table. At first he assumed they were lost, that they were searching for a parent or a restroom sign. He didn't look up right away. Adults rarely do. It took the sudden stillness in Janae's posture to draw his eyes away from the glass. Two girls stood there holding hands, faces serious in a way children rarely allow themselves to be in public. The restaurant didn't notice. Uriel did. The girls didn't rush him. They waited, as if giving him time to understand that this moment belonged to them. The taller one shifted her weight from foot to foot, eyes fixed on the edge of the table. The smaller one squeezed her hand, drawing courage from the contact. Uriel set his glass down without realizing it. "Excuse me," the taller girl said. Her voice wavered, then steadied. "We're sorry to bother you." Her sister leaned closer, whispering something he couldn't hear. They shared a look that felt rehearsed, like a line they'd practiced in the mirror more than once. Then the taller girl lifted her chin. "You're our dad." The words were plain, no demand in them, no accusation, just an offering placed carefully between strangers. Uriel searched their faces for familiarity and found none. He saw his own dark eyes and the curve of one child's gaze, the shape of his jaw reflected in the other's stubborn set. It meant nothing and everything at the same time. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The taller girl swallowed, uncertainty replacing resolve. "Our mom said we should come say hello," she added, as if worried she'd broken a rule. Chairs scraped softly around the room. Someone laughed at a nearby table. The restaurant continued to exist, unaware that the future had just arrived uninvited. Uriel finally stood, hands gripping the back of his chair, trying to anchor himself to something solid. Carmela, Phoebe, the sound of his name in that voice had once been a comfort. Now it was a reckoning. Janae didn't move. She sat perfectly still, eyes traveling from the girls to Uriel, then back again, as if her mind were piecing together a puzzle that hadn't existed seconds earlier. Her hand remained on the table, fingers resting beside his empty glass. Uriel wanted her to speak. He wanted anger or confusion or anything that would break the unbearable quiet forming around them. But Janae's expression held something far more unsettling, patience, the kind that waits not for answers but for honesty. Her lips parted, then closed again. She nodded once toward the girls, offering them a small, reassuring smile that felt like an act of generosity in a moment that required courage. The taller girl smiled back, relief flickering across her face. Uriel felt his chest tighten. This was the woman he planned to marry, the woman who had taught him that presence mattered more than performance, and here she was, facing a reality she hadn't agreed to carry, without making it anyone else's burden. A waiter paused near their table, unsure whether to interrupt. Janae shook her head slightly, signaling that they needed a moment. It was a quiet gesture, but it changed everything. Uriel realized then that he wasn't being confronted by children alone. He was being measured. Raina stepped into view with the caution of someone entering a room they never wanted to see again. Her hair was pulled back in a way that suggested she'd done it in a hurry, strands escaping near her temples. She looked thinner than he remembered, not frail, but sharpened by years that had demanded more than they offered in return. "I'm sorry," she said, already apologizing for things she hadn't yet named. "They've been asking all week. I thought it would be better if—" She stopped when their eyes met. For a second, the restaurant fell away. There were no tables, no music, no strangers pretending not to watch. There was only the woman he'd left behind and the man he had become. "I didn't mean for this to happen like this," Raina added, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. They deserve to know you exist." Uriel tried to speak. His throat closed instead. The girls turned toward their mother, comforted by the familiar shape of her presence. Raina placed a hand on each of their shoulders, grounding them. "This is Carmela," she said gently. "And Phoebe." The names settled over him with weight. Janae rose from her chair then, not abruptly, not in protest, but with intention. She extended her hand to Raina. "I'm Janae," she said. "Let's step outside." It wasn't a command. It was an invitation to face something difficult with dignity. Raina nodded, gratitude flickering through her expression. Uriel followed them out, knowing without fully understanding that nothing about his life would look the same when he returned. The night air felt heavier than the room they'd left behind. They stood on the sidewalk beneath a streetlight that hummed softly, the city moving around them with the indifference of a place that never waits for personal disasters to resolve themselves. The girls leaned against Raina, suddenly shy, as if the courage they'd gathered inside had been spent. "I didn't know how to tell you," Raina said after a moment. "I kept thinking there would be a right time. There never was." Uriel stared at the pavement. It was easier than meeting her eyes. "I should have called you," she continued. "I should have said something earlier, but I was scared you'd stay for the wrong reasons. I didn't want to trap you in a life you hadn't chosen." "You didn't give me any choice at all," he replied, the words leaving him before he could soften them. Raina nodded, accepting the truth in that. "I was trying to protect them," she said, resting her hand on Carmela's shoulder. "And maybe I was trying to protect you too. You were so determined to build something. I didn't want to become another obstacle." Uriel looked at the girls then, at the way Phoebe studied his face, searching for something she hadn't learned to expect, at the way Carmela stood a little taller than necessary, as if ready to defend herself. "How long?" he asked quietly. 10 years, Raina replied. 10 years of school forms and late nights and pretending I had everything under control. The number settled into his chest like a verdict. Janae remained silent beside him, giving space rather than taking it. "I never stopped thinking about you," Raina added, "but I needed to know that if you came back into their lives, it would be because you wanted to, not because you felt cornered." Uriel closed his eyes. For the first time in a decade, there was no strategy to hide behind. 10 years. Uriel repeated the number in his head like a miscalculation he couldn't correct. 10 birthdays he hadn't attended, 10 school years he hadn't known about, 10 years of bedtime questions he'd never heard. He looked at Carmela and Phoebe again, really looked this time. Not as strangers who had startled him in a restaurant, but as children who had lived entire lives without his presence. "I didn't know," he said finally, the words thin against the weight of what they were trying to carry. Carmela shifted closer to her sister. "Mom said you were busy," she offered, as if trying to protect him from feeling worse. Busy. The word landed harder than any accusation could have. He thought about the nights he'd spent staring out over the city from his penthouse, convinced he was missing nothing. He thought about the years he'd invested in becoming reliable to everyone except the people who mattered most. "You didn't fail them," Raina said quietly. "You didn't even know." But Uriel knew the truth lived somewhere between their sentences. He had built a life that made absence look like responsibility. He had trained himself to leave before anyone could need him. And now 2 children were standing in front of him, asking a question his father had never stayed to answer. Janae touched his arm then, not to reassure him, but to remind him that the moment was real. Uriel knelt so he was level with the girls. "I don't have the right words yet," he told them, "but I'm here now, and I want to understand how to be part of your lives." It wasn't an apology. It was a beginning he'd waited too long to offer. Janae didn't go home with Uriel that night. She said she needed air, then corrected herself and said she needed space, as if the words themselves could rearrange the weight pressing on her chest. He watched her walk down the sidewalk alone, hands tucked into her coat pockets, and felt the strange helplessness of someone who suddenly had no script. They met again 2 days later at a quiet cafe near the lake. The place was nearly empty, the early afternoon lull stretching the silence between them. Janae arrived first. She didn't order anything until he sat down. Uriel nodded, unsure how to meet her honesty without adding to the confusion. "I keep thinking about those girls," she continued. "How brave they were, how carefully they stood there like they were afraid of breaking something." She looked at him then, searching his face for a version of him she hadn't seen before. I didn't sign up for this, she said, and I'm trying to understand how something this big could exist in your life without you knowing. He told her what he told Raina, about the breakup, the silence, the years that filled the gap. The words felt thin in his mouth, insufficient to describe how completely he'd believed the past was finished. Janae listened without interrupting. When he finished, she wrapped both hands around her mug as if the warmth might travel somewhere inside her that needed it. I don't want to punish you for something you didn't know, she said, but I also can't pretend this doesn't change everything. Her voice didn't shake. That was the hardest part. I thought I was marrying a man who had chosen his life carefully, she continued. Now I see that you built it by avoiding certain questions. Uriel swallowed. He wanted to reach for her hand. He didn't. This isn't about the girls, she added softly. It's about what you do when things get hard. The cafe filled with the quiet clink of cups and distant conversation, but at their table there was only the echo of a future that no longer felt certain. They walked along the lake after leaving the cafe, letting the cold air clear some of the heaviness that conversation alone couldn't reach. The city moved around them, ordinary and loud, as if their lives hadn't just been knocked off balance. Janae stopped near the railing and turned to face him. This is where I need to be honest, she said. Not brave honest, real honest. Uriel waited. I can handle complicated, she continued. What I can't handle is vanishing. I've spent too many years watching people promise the world and then disappear when it becomes inconvenient. She told him about her childhood, not in detail but enough for him to hear the pattern. A father who drifted in and out of her life, a mother who tried to cover the gaps with optimism. She learned young that love without consistency feels like abandonment dressed up as hope. I won't compete with your past, Janae said, and I won't ask you to choose between me and your children. That's not fair to any of us. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But I need to know you're not the kind of man who leaves when things stop fitting neatly into your plans. Uriel opened his mouth to promise something absolute. She raised a hand gently, stopping him. Don't say it yet, she said. Show it. They stood there for a long time, watching waves brush against concrete that had learned to endure pressure without moving. For the first time, Uriel felt the full weight of what Raina had protected him from. Staying wasn't about declaring loyalty. It was about making room for chaos and choosing not to run from it. And Janae had just drawn a line he couldn't step around. They didn't talk about wedding plans anymore. The binder Janae kept in her bag stayed zipped. The venue tours were postponed with polite excuses. Friends asked questions that were answered with vague smiles and we're just busy right now. Uriel noticed the difference in small ways. The way Janae no longer left her toothbrush at his place. The way she hesitated before answering his calls. The way her laughter, once effortless, now seemed measured, as if she were afraid to enjoy something that might not last. One evening, she came over to the penthouse for the first time since the restaurant. The apartment looked exactly as it always had. Clean, untouched, prepared for no one in particular. This still doesn't feel like anyone lives here, she said quietly, setting her coat on the back of a chair. Uriel didn't know how to respond. They sat on the couch, not touching, the space between them heavier than an argument would have been. I'm not asking you to fix this overnight, Janae said, but I can't keep pretending I'm engaged to the same man I met a year ago. He bristled at that, then recognized the truth in it. That man had believed control was enough. She reached into her bag and took out the ring, holding it between her fingers without slipping it off. I don't know if this should stay here yet, she admitted. I don't want to make decisions out of fear, but I also don't want to hold on to promises that aren't being lived. Uriel felt a rush of panic he hadn't experienced in boardrooms or negotiations. There was no pitch that could save him here. What do you need from me? He asked. Janae studied his face as if weighing whether he could carry what he was asking for. I need to see you choose something that doesn't benefit you, she said. Something that costs you. She placed the ring back on her finger, not as acceptance, but as a pause. This isn't over, she added. But it isn't safe either. For the first time since he'd proposed, Uriel understood that love could be present and still be at risk. Let's pause here for a moment. Uriel isn't choosing between people. He's choosing between patterns, between the habit of retreating when life becomes complicated and the possibility of learning to stay, even when nothing feels certain. So I want to ask you something personal. What would you do if love suddenly became complicated? Not inconvenient, not mildly uncomfortable, truly complicated. The kind of situation that forces you to confront parts of yourself you've avoided for years. Would you hold on and adapt, even if it meant rewriting everything you thought you knew about your future? Or would you walk away to protect the version of your life that still feels controllable? Share your answer in the comments. You don't have to explain it perfectly, just speak honestly. Because stories like this don't matter if they never leave the screen and enter our real decisions. And if you're finding yourself invested in what happens next, make sure you're subscribed to Mr. Williams' Storytime. The rest of this journey is about to test every promise Uriel has ever made, to himself and to the people who now depend on him. Uriel didn't ease into fatherhood. He arrived in it like someone stepping onto a moving walkway going the wrong direction, trying to look composed while everything carried him somewhere unfamiliar. His first morning alone with the girls happened because Raina had an early medical appointment and no one else was available. "How hard can breakfast be?" he said, forcing confidence into the empty kitchen. Carmela raised an eyebrow the way adults did. Phoebe didn't speak at all. She simply sat on the counter watching. Uriel searched through cabinets that held more glassware than food. The penthouse wasn't designed for children. It was designed for showing off. Eventually, he found a box of pancake mix he'd ordered the night before, convinced preparation equaled competence. He followed the instructions, carefully, too carefully. The batter came out thick enough to stand on its own. He added milk, too much. The pan was too hot, then not hot enough. The first pancake emerged half burned, half liquid, an object that had clearly lost its purpose somewhere between bowl and skillet. Carmela tried not to laugh. She failed. "Dad," she said, testing the word the way someone tries on a coat they're not sure fits. "It's not supposed to look like that." Phoebe poked the center of the pancake with a fork. "Is it finished?" Uriel scraped it into the trash and started again. By the third attempt, the smoke alarm protested. He waved a towel at the ceiling while the girls covered their ears, giggling in spite of themselves. When he finally slid two uneven, barely edible pancakes onto their plates, they clapped as if he'd accomplished something heroic. They ate without complaint. Later that morning, after Raina picked them up, Uriel stood alone in the kitchen staring at the streaks of batter on the counter and the burnt smell that refused to leave. For the first time in years, his home looked used, and for the first time, that mess felt like progress. Uriel arrived at the elementary school 20 minutes early. He parked across the street and watched parents gather in loose clusters, trading complaints about homework and lunchboxes. He stayed in the car, rehearsing what he would say when the girls appeared. Nothing sounded right. When the doors finally opened, children poured out in mismatched jackets and loud opinions. Carmela spotted him first. She froze mid-sentence, eyes scanning his face as if confirming he was real. Then she ran. Phoebe followed more cautiously, backpack bouncing against her shoulders. The moment they reached the sidewalk, conversation around them thinned. Parents glanced over, curiosity rising when Uriel bent down to greet them like he'd practiced in the mirror. "Hi," he said, immediately regretting how formal it sounded. Carmela launched into a story about a spelling test he didn't understand. Phoebe hovered closer to him than necessary, her fingers grazing his coat sleeve as if testing whether he'd disappear when she looked away. One of the teachers approached with a clipboard and a polite smile. "Are you their—" "Yes," Uriel answered too quickly. I'm their father." The word felt heavier when spoken aloud. The teacher nodded, making a note he didn't get to see. "They've mentioned you," she said kindly. "It's nice to finally put a face to the name." He didn't ask what they'd said. As they walked back to the car, Carmela skipped ahead while Phoebe stayed beside him, matching his steps. He opened the door for them with exaggerated care, unsure of the unspoken rules. Later that night, when he replayed the moment in his head, he realized what had unsettled him most. No one had treated him like a hero. They had treated him like someone catching up. Uriel bought the tickets weeks in advance. He sat in the third row of the school auditorium, hands folded too tightly in his lap, scanning a program printed in faded ink. Carmela was performing with her class. He didn't know what instrument she played. He was too embarrassed to ask. The room filled with parents who knew exactly where to sit, exactly when to clap. Uriel followed their lead, clapping when they clapped, smiling when they smiled, as if attendance alone might be enough. When the children walked onto the stage, his breath caught. They looked smaller up there, swallowed by curtains and spotlights. Carmela waved wildly until she found him in the crowd. Phoebe sat in the front row beside Raina, legs swinging nervously. The music began. It wasn't perfect. Notes wobbled, timing slipped. None of it mattered. Carmela stood straighter than she ever had, her eyes fixed on the place where he sat. Uriel felt something rise inside his chest that didn't belong to the man he'd spent decades becoming. His vision blurred. He tried to blink it away. It didn't work. Tears slipped free before he could stop them. He pressed his knuckles to his mouth, willing himself to regain control. This was a school recital, nothing life-altering, and yet he couldn't shake the weight of knowing how many moments like this he had missed. Not because he was trapped somewhere else, but because he had built a life that left no room for them. When the performance ended, applause thundered around him. He stood with everyone else, clapping until his palms stung, grateful for the noise that covered the break in his composure. Later, outside the auditorium, Carmela ran into his arms without hesitation. You came, she said, as if surprised. This was the cost he hadn't known how to calculate. Carmilla hugged him like she was making up for time. Not the careful, polite embrace children sometimes give adults, but the kind that knocks the air from your lungs because it comes with no restraint. Her arms wrapped around his waist, her face pressed into his coat as if she were trying to anchor him there. You didn't leave, she said into the fabric. Uriel didn't trust his voice yet. He rested his chin lightly on the top of her head, breathing in the faint scent of crayons and shampoo, feeling the tremble in her shoulders. I told my friend you were coming, she continued. She said Dad'd say that a lot, but you did. The words cut deeper than anything Raina had said on the sidewalk. He crouched so they were eye level. I'm here, he told her. It was all he could manage, without turning the moment into a promise he was still learning how to keep. Behind them, parents gathered children and compared schedules. Life carried on with casual efficiency. But for Uriel, time had compressed into this small, fierce grip. On the drive home, Carmilla talked non-stop about the music, about a boy who'd played the wrong note, about how her teacher winked at her from the wings. Phoebe sat quietly in the back seat, listening, her reflection watching him in the rearview mirror. That night, after he tucked them in at Raina's place, Uriel stood alone in the hallway, absorbing the hush of a home that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with them. He wasn't certain when fatherhood had stopped being a role he was trying on. He only knew that something essential had settled into place without asking his permission. Phoebe waited until everyone else was asleep. Uriel was rinsing a mug in the sink when he felt her behind him, silent as a held breath. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen in pajamas that were too big for her, clutching a stuffed animal with one ear missing. Can I ask you something? She said. He turned off the water and crouched so he wasn't towering over her. Of course. She stared at the floor, tracing the pattern of the tile with her toe. Are you going to leave too? The room seemed to narrow around the question. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was precise, the kind that fits neatly into the space it creates. Uriel didn't rush to answer. He thought about the years he'd spent perfecting exits, about the father he barely remembered and the empty chair that taught him to be careful with attachment, about the penthouse that had rewarded him for staying distant. He set the mug aside. No, he said finally. Not when things are easy, and not when they're hard. Phoebe studied his face, searching for something she couldn't name yet. Then she nodded once, as if filing the response away for later testing. Okay, she said, and padded back down the hall. Uriel remained in the kitchen long after the apartment felt quiet, the weight of that small voice settling somewhere deeper than any professional failure ever had. This wasn't about being good at something. It was about being there when the question mattered. The first time Janae and Raina spent time together without Uriel, it felt less like a meeting and more like a ceasefire. They chose a public park halfway between their homes, a place with a playground that drew children from every corner of the neighborhood. Carmilla and Phoebe ran ahead, climbing and sliding with the confidence that comes from knowing at least two adults were watching closely. Janae sat on one end of a bench, Raina on the other, an empty space between them that felt deliberate. Thank you for agreeing to this, Raina said first. I know it can't be easy. Janae nodded. It's not, but avoiding you doesn't help the girls. That sentence set the tone. They spoke carefully at first. Schedules, school events, who handled what on which days. Janae wrote notes in a small pad she carried in her bag, not because she didn't trust her memory, but because she wanted to show that this mattered enough to be recorded. Raina noticed the gesture. You don't have to do this, she said. Most people would walk away. Janae closed the notebook. I won't pretend I haven't thought about it. But those kids didn't ask for this situation. They just showed up in the middle of it. They watched Carmilla try to convince her sister to go down a slide that looked taller than it actually was. Phoebe hesitated, then went anyway, laughing all the way down. I raised them alone for 10 years, Raina said quietly. I didn't expect to share anything about them. I especially didn't expect to share with the woman he planned to marry. Janae absorbed that without defensiveness. I didn't expect to share my future with someone else's past. But here we are. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, just honest. I'm not here to compete with you, Janae added. I don't want to replace you. I want to understand how to stand beside you. Raina studied her face for a long moment. Then she smiled, not fully, but enough. That's more than I ever hoped for, she said. For the first time since the restaurant, the tension between them loosened. Not gone, but eased, like a knot that finally recognized it might be allowed to rest. The second meeting was less careful. They sat closer this time, shoulders nearly touching as the girls played. Carmilla had claimed a new friend and was explaining rules no one else seemed to follow. Phoebe pushed a swing with quiet determination, stopping every few seconds to look back. You know what surprised me most, Raina said. Not the fact that you stayed, the fact that you asked how I was doing. Janae smiled faintly. I learned a long time ago that strong people still get tired. They talked about logistics again, doctor appointments, school meetings, whose car was better for long trips. But the tone had shifted. It wasn't negotiation anymore. It was planning. At one point, Carmela scraped her knee. Raina reached for a tissue while Janae checked the cut. Neither hesitated. The moment passed like it belonged to both of them. I won't pretend this doesn't hurt sometimes, Raina admitted later. Watching him learn to be a father when I've been doing it alone for so long. Janae didn't rush to comfort her. She respected the truth too much for that. I won't pretend I don't worry, she said in return, about what happens when I become more than the person he dates, about how I fit into something that started without me. They laughed softly at the same time, surprised by how similar their fears sounded when spoken out loud. For years, Raina had carried the narrative that Uriel had chosen ambition over family. For months, Janae had carried the fear that she was building a future on unstable ground. Between them sat two children who had never asked for either version of that story. I don't want them to grow thinking love disappears when it gets complicated, Janae said. Raina nodded slowly. Neither do I. Respect didn't arrive as a feeling. It arrived as a decision, to listen when the instinct was to retreat, to speak when silence would have been easier, to trust that the person sitting beside you wanted the same outcome even if the path there looked unfamiliar. By the time the girls were ready to leave, the space between the women had vanished, replaced by something fragile but real, an agreement not written down anywhere. Yet, healing didn't look like forgiveness at first. It looked like patience practiced in small, unglamorous ways. Janae texting Raina when a school meeting ran late. Raina sending photos when Carmela lost her first tooth. Both women learning when to speak and when to let a moment breathe. There were setbacks, days when old feelings surged without warning. Raina would catch herself, thinking that Uriel got to discover fatherhood in curated moments while she had lived it in exhaustion. Janae would feel a familiar sting when the girls instinctively reached for their mother instead of her. Instead of letting those thoughts harden, they named them. I'm jealous today, Raina admitted once, surprising herself with the honesty. Janae replied, I feel like an outsider sometimes. They didn't solve those feelings. They acknowledged them and went back to doing what needed to be done. Slowly, resentment lost its edge. It was replaced by understanding, not agreement about the past, but clarity about the present. They weren't bound by shared history. They were bound by shared responsibility. One afternoon, as they waited for the girls to finish a dance class, Janae asked, Do you ever regret not telling him sooner? Raina considered the question carefully. I regret the loneliness, she said, not the choice. That answer stayed with Janae. Bitterness, she realized, didn't vanish because someone apologized or time passed. It faded when people chose to stop guarding old injuries and start tending current needs. By the end of the summer, the girls stopped asking which adult was responsible for what. They simply assumed someone would be there, and for the first time, all three of them believed that assumption might be safe. They didn't announce the delay with drama. There was no statement, no social post, no group message explaining the shift in plans. Janae simply stopped scheduling fittings. Uriel stopped asking about venues. When friends noticed the silence and gently inquired, they offered small neutral responses about timing and priorities. Inside their apartment, however, the change was loud. The calendar that once held handwritten notes about tastings and meetings now displayed only work commitments and school events. Wedding magazines remained stacked neatly on a side table, untouched, like artifacts from a version of their relationship that felt distant. Janae didn't take off the ring. She treated it as a reminder rather than a promise, something to be earned daily rather than assumed. Uriel tried to adjust. He left meetings early. He learned which evenings belonged to the girls. He showed up without needing to be asked, but he could sense that effort alone wasn't the currency anymore. What Janae watched for was consistency when nothing was convenient. One night, as they ate dinner in the penthouse that no longer felt as sterile, Janae spoke into the quiet. I don't need a wedding right now, she said. I need to know what kind of life we're actually building. Uriel nodded. He didn't offer excuses. He didn't redirect the conversation toward timelines or reassurance. He listened. The delay didn't feel like rejection. It felt like caution practiced with care. And for the first time since the restaurant, that caution gave him room to breathe rather than taking something away. Janae hadn't planned to invite Carmela into the dressing room. She was trying on a simple pair of heels when she heard small footsteps pause at the doorway. Carmela stood there, holding a ribbon she'd found somewhere in the apartment, her eyes wide with the seriousness children reserve for things that feel important. You look nice, Carmela said. Janae laughed softly. I'm not even dressed yet. That's okay, Carmela replied. My mom says the best part is getting ready. Janae hesitated, then waved her in. Carmela climbed onto the edge of the bed and began sorting through a small pile of accessories Janae had left out. She picked up a hair clip, turned it over, then set it aside like someone making professional decisions. "Do you like being engaged?" she asked suddenly. Janae wasn't sure how to answer. She chose honesty over polish. "I like the idea of being married," she said. "I just want to make sure we're ready." Carmela nodded as if she understood more than she probably should. "My mom said weddings don't fix things," she offered. "She said people fix things." Janae felt her throat tighten. Carmela held up the ribbon. "This is too much, right?" Janae smiled. "Probably." They tried a few things together, none of them right, all of them oddly comforting. For a moment, Janae forgot the weight she'd been carrying. She wasn't deciding a future, she was sharing a present. When Carmela finally hopped off the bed, she hugged Janae around the waist without warning. "I want you to stay," she said into the fabric of her sweater. Janae closed her eyes, absorbing the trust wrapped inside those 4 words. "I'm trying," she replied, quietly enough that it felt like a vow. The wedding didn't come with a countdown. There were no final fittings, no rehearsal dinners circled in red. Instead, there were evenings spent on homework at the dining table, mornings that began with cereal spills and ended with car doors slamming in unison. Life filled the space where ceremony once lived. Janae noticed the change before she named it. The penthouse no longer felt like a display room. There were drawings taped to the fridge. A pair of sneakers sat near the door because Carmela always kicked them off too soon. Phoebe left books in odd places, as if afraid the story might vanish if she put it away. Uriel didn't announce these shifts. He made them quietly. He bought groceries instead of ordering in. He asked Raina what the girls liked instead of guessing. He showed up to meetings tired and unapologetic, as if exhaustion had finally been allowed into the shape of his days. One evening, Janae found him kneeling on the living room floor helping Phoebe with a math worksheet. Carmela was on the couch offering unsolicited advice. Neither of the girls noticed her at first. It struck Janae then how ordinary the moment looked, and how impossible it once felt. She didn't interrupt. She leaned against the doorway and watched a man who used to measure time and profit margins measure it now in attention. Later that night, when the apartment had settled into sleep, Janae joined Uriel on the balcony. The city hummed below, unconcerned with personal milestones. "I'm not afraid of marrying you anymore," she said. Uriel turned toward her, surprised by the certainty in her tone. "I'm afraid of doing it too soon," she continued. "I don't want the day to feel like an escape from uncertainty. I want it to feel like a reflection of what we're already living." He reached for her hand. This time, she didn't hesitate. "We'll wait," he said simply. And in that quiet agreement, something finally aligned. The wedding wasn't on pause because love was missing. It was waiting because love was learning how to hold more than it ever had before. Uriel hadn't been back to the pier since the night he proposed, not because the place was painful, but because it had become too meaningful to visit casually. It marked a before he no longer lived in, and an after he was still learning how to inhabit. On a clear autumn afternoon, he returned, not alone this time. Janae walked beside him, her coat brushing his arm with every step. Carmela darted ahead, racing the wind as if daring it to keep up. Phoebe followed at a slower pace, stopping often to peer between the railings at the water below. The pier felt smaller than he remembered, or maybe he had finally grown into it. They reached the end and leaned against the rail, the 4 of them forming an uneven line that didn't match any image he once carried of family. Yet standing there, he felt something settle into place that ambition had never managed to deliver. "This is where you asked her," Carmela announced, pointing at Janae with unfiltered pride. Janae laughed. "You weren't supposed to tell." "It's not a secret," Carmela insisted. "It's a good thing." Uriel watched the exchange, realizing how differently the pier read now. It was no longer a symbol of a single moment. It was a reference point for a life that had shifted course. Phoebe tugged at his sleeve. "Can we go to the end again?" she asked. He nodded and walked with her while Carmela chased seagulls that refused to be impressed. For years, Uriel had come here to think about where he was headed. Now he came to remember where he had arrived. Carmela took off first. She ran along the boards with no plan beyond speed, her laughter trailing behind her like something alive. Phoebe followed more cautiously, arms out for balance, shoes slapping softly against the worn wood. Uriel watched them with the quiet focus he once reserved for board meetings. There was no agenda here, no outcome to measure, just movement, unfiltered and unguarded, the kind he'd spent most of his life trying to control. "Race you to the end," Carmela shouted back at her sister. Phoebe hesitated, then picked up her pace, surprise brightening her face when she realized she was keeping up. Janae cheered from the railing, not caring how loud she sounded. Uriel stayed behind for a moment, letting the scene play out without him. There had been a time when running children would have registered as background noise, part of the scenery of a city he passed through on the way to somewhere more important. Now every step they took felt like a reminder that he was no longer chasing distance. He was chasing presence. When he finally joined them, Carmela grabbed his hand mid-stride, pulling him into the race he didn't know he'd agreed to. He stumbled, laughed, adjusted. For a man who had built his life on precision, it felt like liberation. Phoebe reached the end first and threw her arms in the air like she'd won something that mattered. Carmela protested, inventing new rules on the spot. Janae filmed the argument on her phone, her laughter echoing down the pier. Uriel stood there breathless for reasons that had nothing to do with exertion. The children weren't performing joy, they were living it, and for the first time he wasn't observing from the edges. He was inside the moment, unprotected and unashamed. They settled on a bench near the end of the pier, the girls finally tired enough to sit still. Carmela leaned against Janae. Phoebe rested her head on Uriel's shoulder, light as a question that had already been answered. For a long time, no one spoke. Uriel watched the water shift beneath them, the steady motion reminding him of all the years he'd spent measuring progress by what moved upward. Salary charts, influence, reputation. He used to think success was something you stood on. Now it was something you sat beside. "I always thought I was building a future," he said quietly. "Turns out I was just building walls." Janae didn't correct him. She understood the difference between confession and conclusion. The girls began arguing softly about who had really won the race. Raina's voice lived somewhere in Uriel's thoughts too, not as regret, but as a recognition of what it had taken for this moment to exist. When he looked down at Phoebe, already half asleep against him, he felt the truth of it settle into his bones. Success wasn't distance from your beginnings. It was returning to them with the courage to stay. He no longer measured his days by what he produced. He measured them by who waited for him when he stopped. Uriel didn't change because his life became more impressive. It became more honest. There was a time when he believed success was proof of worth, that if he could outgrow his childhood, outpace his fears, and outbuild his doubts, he could finally stop running. He thought achievement would protect him from repeating the patterns he'd inherited, but nothing about spreadsheets prepared him for the quiet courage of a child asking a question that had waited 10 years to be answered. The truth is, most of us don't fail the people we love because we don't care. We fail them because we're afraid of being needed, afraid of staying long enough for our absence to matter, afraid that if we pause, everything we've worked for will slip through our fingers. Uriel used to call that fear discipline. Now he calls it what it is, avoidance. He didn't become a better man when he earned more money or moved into a higher building. He became better when he stopped measuring his life by distance, from his past, from responsibility, from vulnerability, and started measuring it by presence, not how far he'd gone, but how fully he was there. The world will always reward ambition. It claps for milestones, praises endurance, celebrates the grind, but it rarely pauses to ask what ambition costs in the rooms where no one is watching. In those rooms, real life happens quietly. It happens when breakfast goes wrong and no one laughs at you, except the people you're learning to love. It happens when you show up late but still show up. It happens when a small voice asks if you'll stay, and you don't answer with promises, you answer with patterns. Uriel didn't erase his past. He faced it. And in doing so, he gave two little girls something he never had growing up, the chance to build trust with someone who chose to stay. Not perfectly, but consistently. And maybe that's the story hiding inside all of this. You don't fix a life by becoming untouchable. You fix it by becoming dependable. So if this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of someone you've been meaning to call, or a conversation you've been postponing, or a promise you've been carrying instead of keeping, don't ignore that feeling. Type the words "show up" in the comments if this story moved you in any way. And make sure you're subscribed to Mr. Williams Storytime, because the stories that matter most aren't the ones that impress us. They're the ones that remind us who we're supposed to be when no one is keeping score.